The topic that we're going to address in this video lecture is globalization. What you need to be reading to understand globalization fully is the second half of chapter 1, basically starting on page 30 and running all the way to the end of the chapter at page 43. Let's start out with the objectives of this particular module. There are 4. First off, students will be able to define globalization and understand the 3 examples we give with regard to the economic, political, and cultural aspects of the process. 2, students will understand what is meant by the phrase increasing interconnectedness of places. The third objective is that students will understand what is meant by the term time-space compression. And finally, I would like all of you to be able to give the 4 examples of the increasing interconnectedness of places that we're going to give in the second part of this video lecture. So let's start out. What is meant by the term globalization? First off, globalization is a very important term, and it's a very big term. It tends to have a lot of ambiguity, meaning it means different things to different people. So if you ask a political scientist, they might give you one definition, whereas if you ask an economist, they might give you a somewhat different definition. So what we need to do at the very beginning of the class is explain exactly what we mean by the term globalization and what geographers basically mean by the term. So let's begin here. For geographers, the idea of globalization is basically that the world is becoming a smaller place. Let me give you an example. Imagine your great-grandparents. If they wanted to travel from Wisconsin to Japan, it would have taken a huge amount of money and months of planning and probably a full month of travel. Well, today, if you can afford it, and quite a lot of people can, they can hop on a plane at Chicago International Airport and be in Tokyo in about 12 hours. So the world isn't technically or literally becoming a smaller place. But because of our technology, it seems to be. Places that were once very distant are now quite literally in our backyards. This is also true when you think about communications technology. The internet means that I can have a real-time, face-to-face, just about conversation with someone 10,000 miles away. And it doesn't cost neither one of us very much. And so both transportation and communication technologies have the effect of basically making the world a smaller place. Now, in addition, the way that we are going to talk about globalization, we're going to include 2 other terms that are also very important to this idea or process of globalization. The first is the concept of borderlessness, which basically just means that the borders between countries, let's say between the United States and Mexico, are less important today than they were, let's say, 100 years ago. Another way of putting this is that the borders between the countries have become more porous, meaning it's easier for goods, ideas, and even people to cross those borders. More is flowing across national borders than probably would have been the case for our grandparents and our great-grandparents' generation. Associated also with globalization is the idea of mobility, that people, goods, ideas, and elements of culture are all moving around a lot more today than they would have been in previous generations, primarily because of technology and the way in which it tends to make the world a smaller place. So let's move on and give 3 very specific and concrete examples of what we mean by globalization. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to divide our discussion into an economic example, a political example, and a cultural example of the globalization process. Let's start out with economic. I'm sure all of you have heard of this very important corporation called General Motors. They used to have a big plant in Janesville, Wisconsin. Well, not that long ago, General Motors might have been accurately described as a national corporation. It had its headquarters in Detroit, Michigan, and nearly all of its factories in the American Midwest. Almost all the cars that were made by GM were sold within the United States. So there was a time when GM was basically contained within the borders of the United States, but that's no longer true. A better word to describe this process of economic globalization is that GM is now basically global motors, meaning they don't operate just in the United States. Because of technology, they now have nearly a global footprint. Yes, they still have their headquarters in Detroit, Michigan, but they have factories in Mexico, and they get parts from Morocco and Belgium. They basically have a global distribution system in terms of assembling cars, but also in terms of selling cars. And they have people on their payroll in places as varied as Mexico and Indonesia. So one way of thinking about it then is that GM has basically jumped out of the borders of the United States. It's no longer contained. It's more of a borderless corporation. And it's also more mobile. It can move around. It can close factories and open them much more quickly than would have been true 25 years ago. Why this is a good example of the economic side, of course, is that GM is a corporation. It's an economic entity that involves itself in economic activity. It's a private company in this particular case. How about the political side of globalization? Hopefully all of you know what is meant by the term NAFTA. That stands for the North American Free Trade Agreement. And you probably as well know that EU stands for the European Union, and UN stands for the United Nations. All of these are relatively recent supranational entities. With respect to NAFTA, it was basically hammered together in the middle 1990s. And what it does is it brings together the United States, Canada, and Mexico into a single economic unit, so that neither one of those three countries can apply a tariff to the import of any good coming from the other two. And what that means is the borders between the United States, Mexico, and Canada have become basically meaningless, at least in an economic sense. They're more porous than they used to be. The same thing is true with regard to the EU. It's basically the same thing as NAFTA, but in the European context. And the UN is basically a global political entity where all of the countries of the world get together. So what all three of these have in common is that they are the product of decisions made by politicians. NAFTA was hammered together by Bill Clinton here in the United States, and the equivalent presidencies of the president, I should say, in Canada and in Mexico. The same thing is true of the EU. It was made or forged by decisions made by politicians. Let's move on to the cultural example that I have here. I'm sure that almost all of you are well aware of the fact that the United States, to give just one example of this process, is much more multicultural today than it was, let's say, for our parents' or our grandparents' generation. In fact, the United States has absorbed immigrants from all over the world, so much so that roughly 13% of the American population today was born outside of the United States. So borderlessness, mobility, and I suppose as well the world is becoming a smaller place, all connect to this idea of international immigration, producing a much more multicultural society here, and quite literally in many other parts of the world as well. So the cultural side of globalization is quite literally the idea that today Korea is in my backyard. And if you don't believe me, I can walk about a mile from my house and I can get Korean food that's pretty authentically made. And that probably would not have been true for my parents or my grandparents. So let's now move on. There is something else about globalization that I would like to discuss with all of you. It has to do with one particular aspect of globalization that's going to be really important for our discussion over the course of the semester. And that particular thread of globalization, if you will, is this one right here. The idea that as a result of globalization, places are increasingly interconnected. What this basically just means is that 100 years ago, what happened in, let's say, China had almost no effect on what happened in the United States. The same thing would be true with Europe. What happened in Europe 100 years ago probably didn't have that much of an effect on what happened in, let's say, Wisconsin. But today, that's no longer true. Globalization means that all places are much more connected, interwoven, interdependent than they would have been not that long ago. And to give just one example, a lot of people right now are discussing the possibility that Greece will default on its debt and will have to leave the European Union. If that were to happen, you probably think to yourself, well, big deal, that's Europe, but it would have a horrible effect on the European economy. And because the European economy is so connected to the American economy, the result would be the American economy would suffer as well including right here in Wisconsin, where we probably have slower job growth as a result of something that happened 5,000 miles away. Now, what we need to do is explore why this is the case, and the primary reason has to do with another concept. It has to do, essentially, with technological advance and something we're going to call time-space compression. Really what this means is that places are more interconnected today because of something happening here with regard to the advance of technology. The effect of this technological advance is the creation of this idea of time-space compression. So to explain that a little further, let's look at the next slide. Look at the image that we have on the left side of this panel. What it shows is how the world is literally becoming a smaller place through technological advance. So let's start up here. It says the year 1500 to the year 1840, so about 500 years ago to about 160 years ago. During that time, because of the technology that we had, distance was really hard to overcome. It took you months to cross the Atlantic. It took you weeks to cross, let's say, the United States. And so distance was quite the barrier. But as time has progressed and we have new transportation and communication technologies, our ability to cross distance has become much more active, if you want to put it that way. We've conquered distance, so to speak. We've conquered geography. And so the effect of transportation and communication technological advance is that distance is literally shrinking. That is the essence of what we mean by time-space compression. It is the engine of globalization. It's the primary reason why globalization is occurring. So I want to give you just a few examples. Let's start out with transportation technology. Let's talk about the railroads. The railroads are actually relatively recent. They're only about 170 years old. But in a way, they were the internet of their era. And here's how. Before the railroads were built, if you wanted to get from Wisconsin to New York City, the only way to do it was to walk, take a boat, take a canoe, or perhaps a stagecoach, and it would literally take you 2 weeks. Once we invent the railroads in the middle part of the 19th century, you can get to New York City in about 12 hours. And so the distance between New York and Wisconsin basically was compressed. Thus, technological advance leads to time-space compression, which ultimately leads to this idea of globalization, where the world is literally becoming a smaller place. Later on, in the 20th century, with the advent of automobiles and the building of the interstate highway network or the freeway network, the same thing is true. But we're compressing space a little further, so much so that the world is now becoming much smaller than it would have been in the 18th or 17th centuries. Perhaps, even more importantly, are advances in communication technologies. Think about, in particular, the internet. Most of you grew up in a world that was already, if you want to put it this way, post-internet. You've had it your entire life, and you take it for granted. But I want to talk about some of the ramifications of the internet. Computers are basically connected to one another through fiber optic cables, or they're connected through Wi-Fi and the satellite system. But the big point is that when computers are connected together, huge amounts of data can flow at relatively little cost across huge distances. For example, I can send a PDF file of a 4,000-page document to China, and it will get there quite literally in real time, and it cost me basically nothing. I mean, yes, there's some cost. I've got to pay for the high-speed internet connection, but it's relatively inexpensive. Compare that to just 100 years ago, where if you wanted to send a document to China, it would take weeks and it would cost you a huge amount of money. So communication technologies basically have the exact same effect. They shrink distance. They bring every place closer to every place else. They lead to more place interconnectedness as a result of this time-space compression. Now, when we get back to the next video, we're going to explore exactly 4 examples of time-space compression, and also more specifically of this idea of the increasing interconnectedness of places.